Welcome back to another episode of Unclocked and Unbothered. Today's guest is someone whose story stopped me because of the specific combination of what she brings to the table. Genevieve has a Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience. She spent 5 years in research settings studying the brain, and now she's a breathwork and somatics instructor, living in Bali, having moved from Canada, teaching facilitators how to understand the neuroscience behind the healing work they do. But before any of that, she was carrying the weight of a turbulent upbringing that had shaped every single one of her coping mechanisms without her realizing it. The turning point wasn't a dramatic experience, it was a decision. She decided she no longer wanted to abandon herself. And from that decision, therapy, somatic work, breath work, and solitude, she rebuilt her relationship with herself from the inside out. She didn't become someone new. She returned to who she was before survival took over. And now she's building a neuroscience-informed certification for facilitators who want to understand the science behind her work without having to go into a 5-year degree. Genevieve, welcome to Unclocked and Unbothered. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to get into this conversation.
Yeah, I'm so honored to have you. You're very interesting in the way that you talk about neuroscience. You help facilitators in their work in this healing space. And not only that, as you come from this turbulent upbringing that we were probably going to start off first and talk about, just to kind of build up and see like how this all started. So I want to start before the shift because I think what makes your story particularly powerful is understanding the full weight of what you were carrying before the change. So what was life like in Canada?
So, Canada was tumultuous, but even before Canada was also a crazy time because I grew up in Texas, which is very southern. Lots of close-minded belief systems, and I really was surrounded particularly by a lot of like really negative men. So a lot of like really negative male influences growing up, and I think that really was one of the biggest things that blocked my own light growing up. And authority figures treating me like less than, even like because I was a child, and yeah, almost like treating me subhuman. And I had that pattern happen a lot growing up. And like going into middle school, going into those formative years of my life, I was like started to like really hide myself and feel like, I was the weird kid or I needed to change who I was being. Yeah. So that whole era of my life was crazy, and I ended up like in toxic, abusive relationships from that point because of like male influences, and then my brain as a child, ended up in situations that were super dangerous, and like unhealthy and like without a full support system. So that kind of prompted me in high school to make a change for myself, and I wanted to move back to Canada because I was like, okay, maybe Canada is where I'm going to find my people. Like, if I move back there, I thought that I would feel, more settled, but that happened to happen during COVID. So when I moved to Canada was in the middle of COVID, actually at the beginning, like September 2020. So that ended up being a whole other chapter of my life because I was in a position where I was looking for external validation, specifically male validation, a lot of like running through drinking and crazy party culture. And at that time, I ended up like in a friend group that was super toxic, and I couldn't see it at the time until like probably 2 years later when I started like a research job and I met a friend who was like, "You're being treated horribly. You need to like look at this." And that sort of like was a turning point for me to like wake up to my surroundings and the people that I was spending time with. It led into like depression, anxiety. I was like, I could barely leave the house. I remember signing up for the gym, and it was the hardest thing for me at the time because I was so anxious to even like get out of my room and go for a walk. And I think COVID also played into that, but I was in such a deep state where I would like drink myself to sleep, And then I would like stay up all night and then sleep the whole day and then wake up and then study and then repeat. And it was like no form of joy or way of living. So,
Wow. Wow. It
yeah.
was like a survival mode. And it probably
Oh,
was shaped by the things that have happened back in, it was Texas, right? Things that
yeah.
happened back in Texas. Then you moved to Canada. Not only that, like you were moving countries at such a young age.
Yeah.
And like, did you feel like you had any kind of support system while you were moving, or you were just like moving by yourself, starting over? Wow.
I
Yeah.
fully moved by myself.
Oh my
COVID,
goodness.
I didn't knew no one in Toronto, so I moved to Toronto, but my
Oh my
family's from
God.
Calgary,
Yeah.
so I knew no one and I was just 18 years old, ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you were just trying to find safety in all of this.
Yeah.
You were trying to move back home or back to a country where you felt like maybe you might feel a bit more understood
Yeah.
than living in America. And not a lot of people know this, but like Canada and America, even though like we're very similar in like cultural sense, it is a bit of a different curve or like learning style. Is just the people are just different everywhere we go, right? So
Yeah.
now you said many of these behaviors that were like toxic or like what you said is you hated in yourself were actually survival responses.
Yeah.
Can you explain more of what that means? What is a survival response and what does it look like when it's running your life and you don't know it?
Yeah. So a survival response can be different for a lot of different individuals. It can look like perfectionism. It can look like hypervigilance, people pleasing, can all be forms of survival responses. And it's literally our nervous system and our body's way of coping with factors in our lives that we had no control over, and trying to find a way to compensate. And these things start to control your life. I mean, it can consume so many aspects of our lives. Like, I can speak specifically to the survival mechanisms that really challenged me, which was like hypervigilance and hyperindependence and also perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I like that was developed in my home life in Texas, and it totally led me to take everything on myself. I don't know if you know about parentification, but essentially it's when a child essentially feels like they have to parent their parents. So when you get to that state of like having to become your own support system from a young age, then you get reliant on only yourself. And so if we're talking specifically with hyperindependence, that is directly linked to feeling like you have to carry the weight of the world on your own shoulders. And so when you feel like you don't have a support system, your brain and body will cope to be able to support yourself. And same thing with perfectionism. It can come from feeling like you're in an environment where you can't make a mistake. You can't, say the wrong thing. So your body starts learning and adapting to how can I create a safe space, that being always never making a mistake, right? And then your body is training yourself to be hyper vigilant of your surroundings to make sure that you're always in line and you're never making a mistake. Yeah.
That's super interesting because on the outside, it looks like hyper independence is just like a fully capable person of being able to be like
Mhm.
resilient and perform well and achieve their goals and stay in control. But it's
Yeah.
really like your brain is constantly providing like this anxious feeling that you need to perform in order to survive. And that's a whole different shift that people don't really see is that like it's actually a survival response in accordance to like a background of like having to perform and take care of yourself.
Yeah.
I love how you brought up parentification and described it because it really resonated with me as well. Like as the older daughter, having to like be perfect, have like always people pleasing and make sure like you appease to a certain view on yourself or a view of yourself to them. Yeah, that's a super interesting way of sharing. Like hyper independence isn't something that should be honored. It's actually a survival skill. And if you're able to kind of balance it, there is also like, yes, it's super important to be able to do your own thing, be your own boss, like make the decisions, but it doesn't come from a place of like having to survive or feeling like you have to be perfect and not learn from your mistakes, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And I speak about this all the time because, like, from the outside at that time in my life, I looked super successful. Like, I looked like I always had it everything together because I created that construct on purpose so that I wouldn't have to reach out for help. Because if I can create this image of, oh, I'm always okay, I'm always taking care of myself, then I don't have to be vulnerable. And then I can be an advice giver, I can be the safe space, but I never have to be vulnerable myself. And I think that's such a big topic to talk about because a lot of the time we can look at like successful women or like hyper independence as like such a strength, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it's finding how to be disciplined and working hard outside of survival mode and learning how to like really develop that in ourselves without needing it to be our entire identity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's like a coping mechanism, and in all of us, we have like this feminine and masculine energy. And sometimes I feel like we are kind of pushed into that masculine, and it almost becomes a toxic masculine energy in ourselves where we can't let our feminine go and create or be playful or make mistakes and learn from them because
Yeah.
our masculine is taking over and being like, no, we have to perform, we have to cope in this way, we have to feel safe. It's making you feel, it's trying to make you feel safe, but and then again, it's becoming like this toxic cycle. That is super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing more about your story. Now, I want to kind of talk about the turning point because you did describe it as a decision rather than an event. You decided you no longer wanted to abandon yourself anymore. What did that actually mean to you?
So I would almost describe it as a series of things that started to spark change. The first thing, honestly, was I got to a point in my life where I was acting out of a place of trauma and not realizing what I was doing, and to a point where I started to hurt other people. And when the consequences of that came back to me, and I realized that that isn't who I was, I didn't even know how to look at myself in the mirror, and I didn't know why I existed on the earth at all because I was like, if I'm a horrible person, then why am I here? Like, I couldn't wrap my head around that. And that was such like a pivotal point for me and like an ego death. And I like started searching for like a higher meaning, like looking into religion, looking into different things because I was like, there has to be something else out there. And there has to be a reason that I'm going through this. And that was a huge turning point for me because that was like my awakening into anything beyond. And I think over time it was slow things like that that would open me up. That was like the first big one. And then I had a huge second like awakening a year later where I just realized I was in that toxic friend group. I didn't want to be treated the way that I was being treated anymore. It was like the end for me of narcissistic abuse cycle, because I had always attracted that in men, but then in this case it was a woman, like the girl that I was friends with, who was narcissistic, and I didn't see that at first until I did. And for me, I was like, I'm never choosing this kind of relationship again. And that was like the first time that I chose myself fully. And I started learning, like, what is a boundary? Like, all of these things that were never taught, and you have to self teach.
Mm-hmm.
And just learning, like, okay, like, I want to start respecting myself and no longer abandoning myself for just for people around me. And that's when I like left Canada and I started working online and I went home for like 4 months and traveled for a bit and I just started doing like deep inner work and started to like really unpack a lot of the events that had happened in the last like year, and then even prior to that, and starting to really get clear on who I was and who I wanted to be, and started making decisions from that place of like, where do I actually want to go and where do I see myself. Um, that was like the biggest initiator for me.
When you were talking about the ego death, and it really showed like your heart because you felt like you weren't being the best person or showing up in the best way to other people, and that's what actually made you start to question everything because you wanted to live life with a purpose of loving, and it came from a heart center space. And I think that's so meaningful, and it really shows like you're here to help or make a bigger impact. And I think a lot of like healers or just people in general will kind of go through these toxic cycles, and they're slowly waking up to being like, why am I in these cycles? Why am I being miserable? And then attracting misery back. So you really woke up and set aside that people pleasing, perfectionism, like that ego, to do the inner work. And that is a lot, starting to work online, leaving friend groups. And the inner work isn't something that's like fun. You had multiple awakenings during that time. You did therapy, EMDR, somatic work, breath healing, journaling, meditation. That's a serious body of inner work. So you kind of mentioned where that started and how it started, but can you kind of explain like what was the things that you were moving through during all of that inner work?
Yeah, so much and so many layers, I feel. At the beginning, like it really started with my EMDR therapist because I remember specifically when I first started working with her and she asked me to like tap into my body and like where does that feel in my body? And I said my brain because I had never once in my life tapped into my body. She's like, that's not your body. I'm like, okay. And I had to like actually sit with that and go, okay, like where is that in my body? And I couldn't pinpoint it for so long. And it took me like a year or so to actually like get into my body and start to like relearn that connection. And now it's funny looking back because there's like science behind that. And like with
Mm-hmm.
trauma, our connection to our body gets severed, and you quite literally physiologically can't connect to the body. So it's super interesting how I went through that process of like having to relearn safety in myself and connecting back to the body. And EMDR therapy is also like it's like reprocessing, so you're rewiring trauma and like brain pathways to be able to move past the almost like severity of triggers and things like that. So that was really transformative for me to start processing a lot of my trauma from my past that otherwise I didn't know how to process. And I made journaling a daily habit, I made meditation a daily habit, and at the time, that is like, those are the things that I needed to do the inner work that I was doing at the time. And I also needed spirituality at the time to give me a deeper sense of purpose and meaning and a why behind like why my life transpired the way that it did. And it also allowed me to always be looking to the future in a positive way, which at the time I needed, but now looking back, I realized was a like there was a lot of things there that was like a coping mechanism and using spirituality really just to cope. But at the time, that was like fundamental for me to start to see myself in a deeper way and also know that my potential for the future was things were changing and things were moving because during that time it was super isolating. It was super difficult to like do all of that on my own. It felt like friendships were falling away all the time because I was becoming this new version of myself that the people in my life didn't recognize. So it was like a super isolating period where I like needed spirituality to be like, okay, there's more for you. But over time, it's so funny how these things start to open up for us because, like, over the last year, I actually have had a crazy collapse of my own spiritual identity and realized that so much of that was rooted in hypervigilance. It was rooted in needing to make meaning out of every little thing as a survival mechanism. And that was also a crazy realization, and like honoring what spirituality was for the beginning of my path and how it's changing now has been a really fascinating thing to watch in myself. Yeah.
Wow, that's such a powerful story of how you explain that. It was some somatic healing therapy, but it's also rooted in spirituality because the spirituality kind of led you to like the hopefulness. I always feel like when I was met with my spiritual path, it gave me more doorways or openings, and it led me down this path where it felt so hopeful. and that I was actually the creator in my next chapter or the future that I wanted. And what it sounded like is at the time you were kind of going through this quantum leap of everything that was serving you at that point no longer served you. And that's why it was kind of like dissolving all the friendships, career, like where you lived, like you had to leave it because you no longer were like suitable in those positions. What were like some of like the biggest revelations or a revelation that you remember while you were going through that period?
Oh my goodness. There were a lot. There were
Mm-hmm.
a lot. I remember there was one meditation that was really crazy for me because it was like tapping into why I was an anxious child because I felt like I was always anxious before I even had a reason to be. Literally, as like 3, 4 years old, when I would be left at preschool, I would envision my living room because it gave me a sense of safety to know that my house was still there at home. And I was like always super anxious. Like when my mom would leave, like I would hold onto the teacher's leg and cry. And then moving to Texas, like my teacher was horrible and didn't care. I tapped into this as in a meditation, and I asked like, where did this come from? And I was pretty much shown during my mom's pregnancy that that's when she developed her anxiety, and that like literally primed my nervous system for anxiety, which is really crazy. And then after that, I like called my mom and asked her like, did you experience anxiety? And she was like, yeah, like when around your birth was like when I like started having extreme anxiety, which was like the
Oh.
craziest thing to learn. So, yeah, that was a crazy period of time, like learning more about like my inner child, and that was really, really powerful for me at the
Mm-hmm.
time. Yeah.
Wow. No, that's really cool how you explain that you went through this meditation and you remember yourself in your mom's womb. It is also correlated with the work I do in fertility and spirituality, is that we are shaped by the womb space that we lived in. So anything that our parents or our mother consumed, their energy that was literally being used to build us, we're then created from. And it's not their responsibility to heal us as we are an adult, but we will come up with these revelations. And it's interesting how you did like call your mom and she remembered that because it also probably was healing, but it came to a point where it was an acceptance and you felt like, okay, that's why this is happening. Now it's time to shape it and move it. And that's what created that inner child healing that has brought you to this space today to be able to like help others as well. So
Yeah.
that's so cool. You also mentioned that when you were in your EMDR work and how you first wanted to tap into the brain, and that's also part of the body, and how there was a sever between the two. In my work as well, I've learned that a lot of women are separated from their womb space, and it's so important that you remember your connection or you try to reconnect that, like the brain, the body, and the womb space all together because our womb is wise and it can show up a lot of revelations as well, especially like if you want to like start the journey of becoming pregnant and having your own children. Like if you are disconnected from your womb, you're going to feel that you're not trusting the process of getting pregnant. You're going to feel like you're blaming yourself. And we see that today. Women, they blame themselves for their infertility. They have a lot of issues when it comes to PCOS and womb health. And that's usually connected through that energetic layer, is that we're not tapping in or reconnecting to our womb. So it's so powerful that you're explaining the spirituality and the body work that comes with it, because we are human at the end of the day, having a soul, like a human experience, but we are a soul. But we have to remember we're also like grounded in our humanness. Now, one more thing before we move on to our next segment here, but you said that healing was not about becoming somebody new. I think that's super important.
Mhm.
But it was about returning to who you were before survival took over. What did that version look like, and how do you know that you were getting closer to her or remembering her?
I've never been closer to who I've always been. And For me, it was like when I started choosing safe relationships and safe environments, my body felt safe enough to start to express the way that I expressed as a child. And I had something I learned along the way is how much I was masking who I was for a variety of reasons, but mostly like it was all wrapped in hypervigilance and safety. And as that started to come out again and seeing my like inner child come out, one of the biggest things was anger. And I suppressed so much anger, specifically when I was like, I would call it like almost when I was in hyper spirituality, because I wanted to be seen as calm all the time and regulated all the time. And I thought that I couldn't have these large expressions, but also because I was scrutinized a lot as a child for being angry. And it's still like a family joke to this day. And so, because of that, I just totally pushed that aside and I didn't want to be that version of myself. And now that I'm in a healthy relationship, that has started coming out again. And it's been the most freeing thing to witness myself actually fully honor and embody my anger. And not even necessarily know what to do with it, but just accept the fact that it's there. That has been the biggest healing point for me, has been just to let myself loose, really, and be free to express the way that I actually express and not apologize for it. When in the past there was so much shame around actually expressing who I was.
That's so powerful because, like, sometimes we forget that anger is also an emotion and emotion is a signal. So when we feel angry, there is a reason for that. And it's kind of like our inner masculine coming, our healthy masculine coming and trying to protect us in that situation. But especially as women, I feel like we're shamed for being angry or being like the angry daughter, right? Like that is such a, it resonated so deeply with me because, we feel like judged when we're angry and someone's actually like upsetting us, but it's
Yeah.
actually like a drive to honor that anger. Honestly, like especially when it's coming from a healthy place of just trying to like protect yourself, it can be such a powerful catalyst. So that's what I also like want like women to know too, is that like if your anger is rooted in something that is trying to protect you, it's not a bad thing. There's no shame around all of your emotions. Like we need to honor them all and not feel judged for it. So that's super powerful what you just mentioned. I love how you frame that healing as returning rather than becoming, because I think like that new you narrative can sometimes actually be really harmful because we're basically bypassing all of that childhood healing that could come up from, like I always say, like, oh, if you forget your passions, like in this life, because society and just this world has been very heavy, remember what you loved as a child. The things that you loved or the things that you dreamed of as a child, because that is actually like your core purpose. And sometimes the new you narrative can sometimes imply that the original one was broken, but you weren't actually broken. You were just trying to protect yourself. And learning to put that down, that projection, is a completely different process than building something from scratch. And you can
Yeah.
do both simultaneously, but it's super important that you also remember that the healing journey is like a returning or an unlearning,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So as we move on to our next segment now, which is basically talking about your life in Bali, the breath work, the neuroscience, I want to talk about what life actually looks like now, because you went from Canada to Texas to Canada to Australia to
Mm-hmm.
Bali. Each move
Mm-hmm.
was intentional. What does life look like now, and how does it compare to where you started?
Yeah, so very, very different than where we started. I've been in Bali now for around 7 months, and life here is really beautiful. It's like very slow living, and I have a lot of time to be creative. And I think that's something that I love about being here is there's so much space and openness for creativity compared to like if I even think back to Australia, like Australia was also very expansive for me, but just in a different way and a different chapter. And I feel like after graduating school in Australia, my nervous system needed Bali to like fully like relax and almost heal from chronic stress, all of the things I experienced while studying. And now living here, it's like I just feel like my nervous system has calmed down so much. And then on the other side of things, I've also experienced more health issues because of coming out of chronic stress. And
Mm-hmm.
now my body actually feels safe enough to express symptoms. So it's like I'm on this whole like healing journey, I guess, like physically mostly right now, and like really just listening to my body and trying to find non-judgment for my own
Mm-hmm.
body and practicing um, really listening to my internal signals. And I think Bali is like the perfect place to do that. We have very flexible schedules, so just being able to go to the beach when we want and like doing creative projects when I want, and it's just a lot more freedom and a lot more expansion than I've ever had in my life, especially compared to Canada. That was like the most restricted and suffocated I ever felt. It felt like I
Mm-hmm.
was like trapped in this apartment, trapped in this box, trapped in a life that I did not want and didn't know how to get out of. And I remember like scrolling on TikTok back then and just looking at people in nature and feeling so envious and just wanting to have that life. And now looking at me, like if I could speak to that version of myself, like she wouldn't believe the life we live now
Mm-hmm.
because I'm living that dream of her. And I'm living that like slow tropical life, like connected to nature, and it's like having that freedom and expansion to like actually do what I want with my life has been like so beautiful. Yeah, so
Wow.
huge contrast between those times.
Yeah, but you did it. Going on TikTok and being like, oh, some people are like, oh, that will never happen to me. But no, you saw yourself different and you wanted that. You used that envy or like that to drive you into doing that. You decided to do something about it. Now, coming from Canada and then going into like this slower pace of life. Did you ever feel like that was a really big transition coming from such a hyper vigilant, hyper independent background and then being able to be like, I have all the time I want, like, and not feeling guilty about it or like seeing the people and how they just live their lives? Was there like an integration period?
Absolutely. And it even came before I went to Bali. It was like the months in Australia before moving, the most internal battle ever because everything in me wanted to have something to do, wanted to have structure, wanted to have routine, wanted to just be productive in some way. And like it ended up me just like scrolling on my phone constantly because I had so much free time and then feeling horrible because I just spent how many hours scrolling on my phone, but then not changing the behavior because I'm like, well, I have free time, so what else am I gonna do? Because I didn't have any form of structure. And that led me to a point where I just did a whole phone, like social media detox. And I just started living life with no like dopamine. And that was a crazy experiment for myself because I just started reading more books and like going on walks and just like getting more creative and doing more things that like were just slower paced. And the internal frustration that I felt doing those things, it was really, really strong. That helped me rest and rewire. So then when things started moving again, I actually had capacity to hold that.
Mm-hmm.
So I like needed that transition time of like frustration, but like also my nervous system and my brain needed that like dopamine detox and to actually just come back to real life and go, yeah, this is life. Life is slow and I need to let it happen slowly instead of trying to always push to the next thing. Yeah.
I feel a lot of people are stuck in that loop of wanting that next dopamine hit, and their attention span is super short.
Yeah.
So it was very powerful for you to be on a detox, pick up books and study because I think that prepared you, even though you didn't know like your what your next step was, that you were like going to go to Bali and live this like slower paced life. It was like slowly preparing you for that,
Hmm.
right?
Exactly.
Um, Now, were you also working online at the time? Social media is super powerful when it comes to our work. Or did you like slowly start that work after those few months of a detox?
Yeah, so at that time, I was like trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I didn't know if I wanted to start working with one-on-one clients. I was kind of looking for studio jobs in Melbourne at the time, but I like it there was a lot of resistance in me and not really knowing what the next steps were. So that time period was kind of just giving that space to breathe and figuring out like, okay, what do I actually want to carry forward? What do I not?
And do you still kind of practice it to this day now that you are in the online space and have like a big social media presence and you have to constantly be keeping up with that? Do you still kind of give yourself those detoxes, maybe not for months at a time, but do you still practice that or bring that into your life today?
I really try. Like I
Mm-hmm.
really do. But I also struggle for sure. Like I think that period of time I was like in a whole different state and I was doing a lot better with that. But now I'm like trying to find a balance again of like not constantly scrolling, especially because I still have a lot of free time. But it's definitely got its ups and downs. It's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a journey. Yeah.
It's definitely like this ebb and flow because I remember when I was at a time, like right when I got fired back in December, and then I had all this free time, and I had like I'm the type of person that like I can do something if you give me it. Like if you give me direction, like, oh, you're gonna start a podcast in 7 months, I'd be like, great, let me read books, let me do this. But if I don't know what I'm doing, using that guilt and then instead getting that quick dopamine hit and just being on my phone. And now I feel like I've kind of traded it for still being on my phone, but it's for work. It's to find content and create content. And it's kind of like I traded one for the other, but this one has more direction. And I'm still trying to find like this space where I don't have to constantly be on my phone. Even taking a day off and not posting makes me feel super guilty. Like I
Hmm.
just started and I'm like, oh, but then I'm not going to show up consistently to the algorithm, and then I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that. And you should just create because you want to create. Like that's what will come off authentically. Don't force yourself into it. So I'm like trying to slowly do that more, right?
Hmm.
And
I really
but yeah,
relate to that too.
it's
Yeah,
hard. We live in a
it
world
is
where
hard.
it's is we have to constantly be showing up, and I'm grateful for it, but
Hmm.
just for the nervous system itself, I got to learn how to cope with it. But
Yeah,
you also mentioned that when you were in this like slower pace of life and that the survival skills or the survival mode kind of dissolved, right? Then some health, the body started to signal some health concerns.
yeah.
That also happened to me as well. And not only
Hmm.
like health concerns, but like more trauma or like things that I don't remember. And now I'm actually safe to like explore those routes with me, right? That's super interesting. And I wanted to kind of talk more about that and how you were able to work through these things, even though like now you're still currently dealing with the health and the signals that are coming up. But what do you do, or what do you like tell the person that is finally shifted out of survival mode and is now working with these health issues or trauma that's coming up that might not know how to navigate it?
I would say the biggest thing is self-compassion and being gentle with yourself and your own body's timeline. I think at first for me, there was a lot of like frustration and like feeling like I'm doing everything right. I'm exercising, I'm eating well, I'm doing all of these things. And like for me, it was like mainly gut issues. Diet and exercise are only going to go so far because at the end of the day, our mental health affects our body like so much more than anything else. And so I have just really developed more self-compassion for like any sort of symptoms that I'm experiencing. At the end of the day, all I can do is be patient and connect to my gut or whatever part of my body's hurting and just like give it support. And that's yeah, that's like the biggest thing I can say, but it's so challenging. And really, anyone who's experienced chronic health issues or like chronic pain or anything around that, like it can feel super hopeless. And like I've felt that too with a lot of my issues because I also had a back injury, so that like flares up once in a while, and that's super frustrating for me as well. I feel really hopeless, especially when you're doing all of the quote unquote right things. Um, but I think, yeah, just like slowly being patient with yourself and knowing that like you're not doing something wrong.
You bring up a really important aspect of like health and science, but also embodiment and compassion. But we also have to remember that these things will come up because of trauma or things that have happened to us, and we have to remember that some things are just healed with time and compassion. Now, you're building a neuroscience informed certification for facilitators. What's the gap you're filling, and what are facilitators missing that this gives them?
This is all about science literacy and bringing in a scientific lens for any facilitators or coaches that want to add a like science-backed approach to what they're doing. So whether that's like speaking with clients or like doing your own talks about things for groups or clients, or sharing on social media about different scientific lenses, and it goes into a lot about like the nervous system and the basics of how our brains and bodies work, and then into like stress and trauma and how that affects our stress systems and our developmental neuro, like we're even what we're talking about around like prenatal stuff and like the mom's womb and how impactful emotions and like as well as nutrition and everything, but like our mental state is on pregnancy and how we can actually be genetically predisposed to a lot of different conditions depending on even just the pregnancy. And a lot of this stuff around how we're shaped and conditioned as children, into identity, ego, how our brains and bodies become the way that we are. And then I talk about how we can start to change that and shape that through neuroplasticity and working with things like breath work and visualization, and how we can actually use these modalities to learn that we aren't stuck in what we were born into. This really comprehensive course for like any facilitators that want to learn science and teach science without having to do a whole degree. Yeah.
That's super amazing. So you're using like your background and your education and your university and your degree, and also like your spiritual path to be able to like form both together. What you're describing is something I think is genuinely missing in this space, is the bridge between the why and the how. And people can do the work without understanding why it works, and understanding why it works doesn't just make you a better practitioner, it makes you more committed to the process when it's harder for your clients or even yourself, because you know what's actually happening. So before we keep going, you've already told a little bit about the certification. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about it right now? This is like kind of your spotlight time to share what you do, how they can find you. All the links will be in the show notes. But yeah, just a little platform here if you wanted to share a little bit more about yourself.
The goal is for it to be a mix between the holistic space, the scientific space, and to also learn facilitator skills. So it's kind of a combo of all of these things. And like, I'm a huge, like, I love interdisciplinary work. So like, this course is really focused on interdisciplinary stuff. I'm slowly creating a wait list. So if anybody is interested in that, I can put the link in your show notes for the wait list. But there's going to be like a workshop at the end of this year that's going to be a free workshop, just like as a taster and getting to know what this course will be about. And then next year I'm going to do my first cohort. So yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, so go follow Genevieve on Instagram. Her links will be in the show notes. You can send her a DM to join the waitlist for the certification. And if you're a facilitator or practitioner, this could be the missing piece. It's super interesting to learn more about. Definitely want to join that free workshop at the end of the year. That will be super exciting to see that kind of come up. So before we end off here, I want to spend some time here at the end kind of just talking about what you know about transformation that people can sometimes maybe misperceive. You've been through the full arc personally, and now that you understand the science behind how it works, what do you know about transformation that you couldn't have known from either side alone?
That's a great question. Transformation is really multifaceted and it's not one size fits all. And that's exactly why I do the work that I do, like in an interdisciplinary way, because it's like that bridge between the two worlds, and bridging as much as I can together between different philosophies and different aspects of life, because it's all interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many different lenses that you can take to look at transformation. But at the end of the day, it's like our own personal experience and anything that we gain along the way that is inspiring to us and brings us internal motivation to change and be a better version of ourselves, like that is the most powerful thing. So finding the thing that inspires you and like really running with that and using it to the best of your ability. Yeah.
I love how you said everything's interconnected because it's such a skill to be able to find those bridges or those gaps and create bridges. Because it is kind of something that does take that interdisciplinary work, but also like that creative side too, because like it's really important that you have that duality in everything that you do. It is multifaceted. So that's a great answer. Now, I want to go back to when you mentioned that you moved countries multiple times as part of this process. What does environment actually do to the identity? We talked about how the slower pace of life started kind of in Australia to Bali. Is location change a shortcut or is it more complicated than that?
I think it depends on the person and it depends on what you're trying to get out of that change. Like for me, environment was huge in my healing because I really thrive in warmer climates. And for me, I was really depressed, like always with clouds, always with really cold weather. And so like I knew that about myself that I wanted to live somewhere warmer. Um, and also the decision to change my environment was a multitude of factors, but the biggest one was knowing that there's more for me out there. And so
Mm.
when I was in an environment and I knew that that environment had run its course and I've gotten what I needed out of that situation, it's like I had an almost an internal knowing of like, okay, now it's time for me to move on and start a new chapter. And for me, that happened to look like changing locations, but for other people, a new chapter could be a new job or a new relationship or something like that. So, yeah, I think it's listening to your own internal compass and really sitting with yourself and knowing, like, am I doing this to escape or am I doing
Mm-hmm.
this because I'm actually ready for change? Yeah.
Yes, yes. It doesn't come from a place of like running away from your problems because your problems will still meet you there. But it's
Yeah.
knowing that like this location or this environment does not serve me right now. Like I want to go explore. And you also mentioned how it's expansive. Traveling can open your eyes, especially if you're from like the Western society where it's very, very rigid and we're like born into like this schedule system straight from birth, like daycare,
Hmm.
school, university, work, and then getting the time when you're fired or you take a gap year and then you question everything because we're trying to expand. We're not running away from anything here. For our last question here, what do you want to say to the person who is in the thick of it right now? Maybe in a toxic environment, toxic friendship, maybe struggling with their body, maybe just exhausted from performing a version of themselves that doesn't fit, who doesn't yet believe that they can change. What do you want to say to that person?
Don't give up. That is the biggest thing that I can say, and that's the biggest thing that I needed in those moments as well was things are going to get better. Things are going to change, and we can make decisions every single day to take steps towards the things that we truly want. I think it's all about like slowly gaining the courage to take chances on ourselves and believing that we're actually worth it and we're worth the life that we genuinely want for ourselves, and it's not impossible. And yeah, I think it's just like developing that inner sense of courage and just saying, you know what, I want to do this for me. I'm going to choose me, and I don't have to stay stuck in a situation that I am no longer choosing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing answer. There's also a lot of neuroscience that's backed by that answer. Is that those slow micro actions of being courageous? It doesn't start all in one day and being like, "Oh, I know how to do everything," or "I'm going to do this." Like sometimes people can hear that statement of like believe in yourself or trust in yourself,
Mhm.
and it doesn't fully comprehend because they're just so stuck in that toxic loop. But don't necessarily feel like it, but I'm going to try like one little thing every day to move myself forward.
Yeah.
you're like the neuroscience behind that is like it is training your brain. There was another guest that was talking about neuroscience and how we only really control like 2% of our brain.
Mm-hmm.
So our subconscious is so powerful. So if we can use that 2% to at least retrain that 98% slowly over time,
Yeah.
then you will start to believe in yourself. Then those fears will kind of shift and you'll move through them and kind of unlearn. That's super powerful too. It's like unlearning and retraining the brain back to yourself and back to your true purpose. And
Yeah.
I think the most underrated part of any transformation is not the method, it's not the modality, it's not even the work itself. It's the moment you decide that you're worth changing for. Before you have any evidence of what's going to work, that decision is everything.
Absolutely. And like I tell people, the biggest thing that changed my life more than anything I tried, more than breathwork, more than journaling, more than meditation, was taking chances on myself. It was literally starting to make one decision. It started me deciding to go to the gym one day and breaking my fear of leaving the house, one decision after the other, and saying, I'm going to just take this leap on myself because I know that this is going to lead me somewhere there that I need to go. And I just kept doing that consistently until I literally built the life that I truly wanted for myself.
No, it's like you have to tell yourself these things, and you're always going to be met with two paths, right? And I always say, like, do the one that's scarier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do the one that's like, because typically that's where more can be learned and more revelations will come out of. And the worst that can happen is that you just go back and take the other path. The only person that's stopping you from that guilt is your ego, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ego deaths that happen in that as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
Genevieve, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This was your first podcast, and I'm so honored to have you. You answered the questions so lovely, and I was so interested in your story. I think the audience is going to resonate with it and take something and learn from it. And definitely, if her story resonated, please give her a follow on Instagram and definitely like follow that free workshop at the end of the year. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we end off today?
Just
Yeah.
think, follow your dreams. That's what I have to say.
Follow
Follow
your
your
dreams. Yes, for real. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
It's so true. It's like literally like we were told this as a child, and then slowly we just started to forget that we
Truly.
are the creators of our own dreams. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Unclocked and Unbothered. Genevieve said something today that I've been sitting with for a while. What I keep coming back to is the reframe she gave us early in the conversation, that the behaviors we hate most in ourselves are often just survival responses, not character flaws, not proof that we're broken, but proof that we were trying to stay safe in an environment that didn't feel safe. So be a little bit gentler with yourself, not because you not because you don't need to grow, but because the version of you that developed those patterns was doing the best they could with what they had. You can find Genevieve on Instagram and the details to her certificate program and the details to her certification program waitlist in our show notes, where you can also find me as well. Where you can also find me as Mel. Where you can also find me as well. I'll see you in the next one. Stay unclocked and unbothered.